listening to Turning Hard Times into Good Times with your host, Jay Taylor. If you have a question or comment about today's show, Jay would love to hear from you at 1-866-472-5790. That's 1-866-472-5790. You can also send an email to questionsfortaylor@gmail.com. That's questions, the number 4, Taylor@gmail.com. Now, back to our program.
Welcome to this special edition of Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm here with independent economist John Williams, who has remained independent from the propaganda that is required of most economists if they want to make a name for themselves as workers in what may well be described as a house of ill repute on Wall Street and at the Federal Reserve Bank, where the false economic religion of Keynesianism is practiced, no matter how much its doctrine has been disproven over many decades. Well, John is one of the few economists that I know who has managed to earn a living through his honest efforts. Long ago, he realized that data that comes out of the government is tainted for propaganda purposes to make those in power be viewed as doing a great job in managing the economy. Of course, the founding fathers of this country never believed that government should be involved in managing the economy. They understood that if people are free from government interference, their God-given creative genius could be put to work for the best of everyone. And unfortunately, those so-called progressive politics that entered into our system back in the early 1900s, of the income tax and the Federal Reserve, has undermined that freedom. And after the Great Depression of the 1930s, politicians seeking to gain power and serve their own interests rather than, in my view, rather than letting the American people go about their business and doing well for themselves. Well, as that happened, along with the Federal Reserve and the detachment of the dollar from gold, we started having the problems that have been building on top of each other. Whenever we have these credit problems that spring up every 10 years or so, they're never fixed. They're just papered over. And John Williams definitely understands this as well as any economist that I know. Now with massive amounts of debt, a tiny little Chinese virus has been let loose by the Chinese, is toppling the global economy into a massive depression, the likes of which will most probably be much greater than that of what we experienced, let's say, in the most recently at the 2008 episode. Some people are suggesting it's going to be worse than the 1930s. Many people think this will result in a massive deflation, the likes of that of the 1930s. But John Williams has always maintained, at least in recent years, that the end result of the next major credit implosion will not be deflation, but perhaps even hyperinflation for the United States of America. So it seems totally appropriate at this time to talk to John for an update regarding his views and to find out what he's seeing in the data that he collects so faithfully week after week. I should mention before I say hello to John, you should jot down, it's shadowstats.com to sign up for John's letter. It's a very reasonably priced newsletter, and if you really care about the truth about what's going on in the economic sphere and in the money markets and so forth, there's no better place to turn than John Williams' Shadow Stats newsletter. Thanks for joining me, John.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
Well, it's always good to talk to you. We haven't done it enough in recent months, but certainly when I see what's going on now with trillions of dollars being printed, it just seemed like the right thing to have you on again. So, John, even before this Chinese coronavirus set off this global recession, some are suggesting it's a depression, you were warning for some time that America was on a path towards hyperinflation and that there would be no turning back. Can you review the budgetary fundamentals for your thesis and why you have really held fast to this view that there would be no way out except to print massive amounts of money, leading to a hyperinflation? Can you review that for our listeners, please?
Sure. The course of fiscal policy in the United States has been almost unending in terms of explosive deficit growth, never funding the future needs, fully funding the debt of the United States going forward. I started talking about a great hyperinflationary recession back in 2005 after the government published its numbers. They publish statements each year using generally accepted accounting principles, and they work out really what the unfunded liabilities are and put net present value on that. And in 2005, the real value of the unfunded liabilities doubled to something like $18 trillion at the time. Just unbelievable, and it was because the government had gone hog wild in terms of expanding benefits for Medicare and such.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to people in the administration, which was a Bush administration at the time, and at the Fed, it was a Greenspan Fed. Oh, they said it was too far in the future to worry about. That's well, we're in that future right now, and it's the unfunded liabilities are beyond control. They're effectively over $100 trillion that we need in money today to bring our system into balance, and we can't balance a budget deficit in 1 year. Right now, in response to this terrible pandemic hit to the economy. Keep in mind, the economy was already slowing down, and we'd actually seen some. If you go back to the fourth quarter of last year, retail sales. This is for the fourth quarter holiday shopping season.
Yep.
That actually contracted after inflation quarter to quarter. Industrial production, the manufacturing sector contracted quarter to quarter. That's not a booming economy or what the Fed was claiming was a sustainable positive growth. The Fed is a major culprit here in terms of what's happening, because you go back to the Great Recession and the collapse of the banking system. What they did then was they bailed out the banking system, created whatever money they had to do, but did very little to help the domestic economy as seen by the average person. Trying to get out of that, and in the last year or two. But as they tried to back out of what they'd done, all of a sudden they're tightening up, put the economy, hit the economy, some putting it into a new recession, and then backed off and started to cut rates again with the arguments with Trump about where they were headed. And then this coronavirus comes along and slams the system. And what we're seeing now with the economy, it's not fundamentally driven by economic weakness. It's driven by the effects of the pandemic. And until such time as that you reverse all the restrictions and can stabilize that, you're going to have a very difficult time. Right now, as we're looking at the first quarter of 2014, we'll be getting the GDP on that actually the end of next week. Based on what's already been reported of underlying series, you're probably going to see a year-to-year annualized contraction of about 8%. That would rival what you saw in the Great Recession. But that's the reason it's that mild, is that because in that first quarter, you have January and February at sort of reasonably stable levels, but March is when it's hit. So that's just 1 month's hit. The second is going to be down probably 30-40%.
Wow.
Pace that'll rival anything seen in the Great Depression. But again, this is not driven by economic issues per se. It's the pandemic. Now, in response to this, you have the administration that has opened up all its deficit spending and will do whatever it has to do to try and support people and give them liquidity. The Fed, God bless them, is still looking to keep the banks afloat and the financial system, and they're flooding the system with liquidity to infinity. They will do anything they have to do. It's really unprecedented. And what I've always been afraid of was that you'd have a circumstance like this more likely driven by economic circumstances. I wasn't looking at a pandemic.
Right.
You now have effectively a Great Recession, Great Depression in hand. It'll, as the pandemic is smoothed out, things are resolved. If you get good news in the quarter or two ahead, conceivably you could be bottoming out in the economy by the end of the year. But that's not stopping the spending that we're seeing by the federal government and the Fed to keep the system afloat. And that's where you have inflationary risk, because you've got too much money there now chasing too few goods.
Mm-hmm.
Got a lot of cash in the system. A lot of people need it, but you're also seeing product tightening up, shortages in certain areas, and that's when people start bidding the price of goods up. And if they have a lot of cash, that's where you start to see an acceleration in the inflation rate.
Mm-hmm.
One leading indicator to inflation is the money supply,
mm-hmm.
and I track M1, M2, and the old M3 on a weekly and a monthly basis. M3, the Fed no longer publishes. I don't think they wanted to, but the numbers, all the component numbers are still there. It's just a matter of putting them together. But what I saw in the this last month, actually, the first week of April, we were moving in this direction. But in the first week of April, we're seeing the highest year-to-year level of growth in money supply M1, M2, and M3. Highest level ever.
Really?
That's to me an indication that you have some inflation on the way.
What sort of numbers are we looking at there, John? If just in ballpark numbers, growth
numbers.
Well,
if you look at M1, year-to-year change is 26%.
Wow.
M2, 15%.
Uh-huh.
M3, the old M3, 17.5%.
Wow.
You've gotten close to that, but those are actually the highest levels ever seen, and this is as far back as they've traced the numbers, which goes back into the 50s. You're seeing what I look at here in terms of inflation and measuring inflation. Inflation is very key to how you protect yourself.
Sure.
You look at headline inflation.
Yeah, the one the government puts out.
That the government puts out. They understate it by about 10 percentage points.
Mm.
I've been tracking that since the 80s.
I know you have.
And what happened there, very simply, if you look at it in a historical perspective, Nixon took the dollar off gold. I think it was in 72.
In 1971, actually, John.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sure of that. August 15th. I remember it very well.
I remember it too, but my memory's not quite as good as it used to be.
Mine either, but that one I do remember.
So what happens at that point?
Mm-hmm.
If you plot the headline inflation, and I've done this with the help of others back to the days of New Netherland,
mm-hmm.
when New York was under the control of the Dutch. And if you look at the annual inflation as estimated over time, and it's basically on consistent basis, against the price of gold, they track each other.
Mm-hmm.
For literally over centuries up to about 1980. You can still buy a loaf of bread for the same amount of gold or silver basically you could in ancient Rome.
Interesting.
I was in a conference once, and some guy was talking about how his mother complained that in her youth in the 1920s she could get a third row center seat on it for a Broadway play for $5,
mm-hmm.
and how much it costs today. My point to him was, well, if she's had that $5 gold coin that she'd bought the ticket with back in the 20s, she could still get a
mm-hmm.
third row center seat on Broadway.
Mm-hmm.
Gold measures the cost of living. And what happened when they changed this, the way they calculated the CPI, that was done in the early 80s very specifically to cut the government's overhead and adjusting cost of living adjustments for Social Security and government pensions. But the inflation picked up after we went off the gold standard. That was mm-hmm. off the gold standard. Inflation starts to pick up.
It sure
so they
did.
changed the inflation's measure.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest thing they did right in the early 80s was they changed the way how the cost of housing was measured. Believe it or not, it used to have an element that measured the price of buying a new home. That was a bad problem for them. So what they did was they invented what they called homeowners equivalent rent.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was that the government would estimate how much a homeowner would charge to rent his own house to himself, and however much he'd raise that rent each month to himself to live in his house would be the element of the inflation that they put into the CPI.
Huh.
The effect of that one change, 1.5 percentage points off the annual CPI number.
Wow. They did other things too.
But
They did other things. I remember you talking in the past about hedonic pricing and substitution, that sort of thing as well, right, John?
that came afterwards, and the general overall effect is right now, instead of seeing inflation that recently has been in the 2% range, we had a little hit last month from the oil circumstance. It's up around 10%.
Mm-hmm.
If you measured inflation the way it was back before they started making the changes in 1980. So what I've done, and I'll make it available to you. I have a plot of gold versus the headline inflation going back 100 years, and if you plot that, this is the headline CPI. Plot that, it follows it up to the Nixon days.
Uh-huh.
Then as they start modifying the CPI just sort of slows down, a nice flattening out curve.
Uh-huh.
But if you put in my numbers as to what it would have been, and I still calculate it the way they used to. They put in their measures of how much all these changes affected the CPI. I just add it back in. What you find is that the CPI goes up exponentially along with the price of gold.
Well, John, let me just ask you, do you have a chart that shows that?
Yes, I do.
Oh, I'd love to see that. And possibly make it available to my listeners and to my subscribers, if that's possible.
Certainly can.
Okay, great. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Well, as long as we're interrupted, it is. If you look at I think if you go back 2 commentaries, you'll see the plot of it.
Uh-huh.
But it's what it does again. If you look at the actual inflation against the price of gold, gold tracks it.
Very interesting.
And that is, so my contention is that gold is, it looks like it's a great investment against the dollar. Well, it is, and that the dollar is being devalued, but it's really measuring, it's a measurement of the cost of living. It maintains the cost of living, the purchasing power of your assets. If you hold the gold, you don't lose your purchasing power. If you hold the dollar, you do. At least the current dollar.
All right.
So that's what I'm going to get back to as to why you want to be holding physical gold.
Sure.
But what we're seeing here is likelihood or a good chance here of a hyperinflationary Great Depression.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know if this will ever be called a Great Depression because it's sort of caused by an extraneous factor, this pandemic.
Right.
The effects to the consumer are going to be very similar. People are already suffering, and it's if you hold your cash, if you convert your cash to precious metals, what you're doing is protecting the purchasing power of your dollar.
Right.
You get into a circumstance here as you start to see inflation picking up, and right now we're seeing inflation right now that's maybe 9% because of the big hit to oil prices year over year, but it's going to be back up 10% very shortly. As you see gold prices rising, as we've seen recently, what that's telling is that the real cost of living is rising, and my numbers generally should be rising with that. So that the gold is telling you where your cost of living is going, what you need. Again, if you hold the gold, you're maintaining the purchasing power of your assets.
Absolutely. John, let me ask you this. Generally when you have one of these credit inflation or credit contractions that, I think we're having and we're going to have it en masse. I know the government is trying to offset that with massive amounts of printing press money. But generally when we see, the equity markets tank, the bond markets, everything goes down like it did in 2008, then you have initially you have a declining price scenario in many different areas because people can't afford to buy anything. Everything gets sold at fire sale prices, et cetera, et cetera. And the initial shock is one of deflation or let's say I don't think it's really deflation because since 2008 we've seen the massive inflation in the stock market, the bond market, and so forth. But when you have one of these contractions, you have generally the first signs are of collapsing prices. Do you think we'll see that this time?
No, that's. I mean, there may be. We've had collapsing oil prices because of the craziness going on with that. But generally, again, this is a little more like Weimar Republic Germany.
Yeah.
Have shortages.
Yes.
You see shortages, and people still will have some money. And in fact, with the more the government sends in and the more the Fed pumps into the system, the more cash there should be flowing around. So the people have the ability to bid up things, and as you end up with a shortage in product and more than enough cash to cover it, you'll see the prices begin to be bid up. And again, in terms of actual inflation happening, I'd watch the gold price. If people see the since that's happening. I mean, I've had some incidents cited to me of some local issues with shortages of certain products that people buy regularly, and all of a sudden they're jumping $5, on a dollar item.
Yeah. So John, so you think that if we watch the gold price, that's probably going to portend, 6 months or a year or so in advance of the kind of inflation people are going to witness when they go to the grocery store or the hardware store?
It varies, son, but with what we're seeing right now, I think it's going to be generally more of a coincidence, or maybe even a little bit of a leading indicator as people see the circumstances unfolding. You have a lot of people who have been looking for issues here, and it gives you the safety of having a liquid asset that maintains your purchasing power. And the amount of money they're pumping into the system, it's got to give you a very rapid inflation not too far down the road, and they're looking to keep going as long as they have to. I can't tell you when this is going to end. I should certainly hope that we'll start to see some bottoming and things in the economy by the fourth quarter if we see good things happening with the pandemic situation.
Yeah, right, for sure.
But that's problematic. There's some issues there. So that's highly uncertain, and the damage that has been done. You have, you're going to find that there are businesses that are lost, supply chains that are broken. It's going to take a little while to recover and get back into the swing of things here.
Oh,
I think it's going to take us a while to get back to where we were, and I'll contend that this actually may be a shift in the basic economy and people's attitudes going forward. If you look at the consumer confidence and the consumer sentiment numbers, they basically survey people how do you view the economy. That doesn't get extraordinarily complex. Generally, it's designed to always have as positive reading as it can come up with. If you look at those numbers historically, and they generally go back to the early 60s, I think, with the Conference Board, and back to the 50s with the University of Michigan with its sentiment survey. Both surveys hit their all-time high in January of 2000. They plummeted with as we got into the early days of the 2000 recession, and then took a big hit with the terrorist attacks. They never recovered their pre-terrorist attack highs.
Ah, wow.
That was decades ago. So I think that the terrorist attacks had one of those major systemic hits on people's outlook. I'll contend that you're likely going to see something like that with this pandemic.
Yeah.
So that where you had that with the Trump administration, you'd almost gotten back, but still shy of, and had been bouncing below. It wasn't really the highest level since, but it was well up there. And now it's dropping off sharply. It's heading back to the troughs of recent decades, and I doubt that it'll be a long time before you get back up to the levels that you saw earlier in the Trump administration.
Right. Well, John, I want to ask you this. I think you alluded to it. We could have some real structural changes here, it would seem to me. If you have a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of restaurants, for example, I mean, it's hard to see people going back into restaurants right away. Those that survive, and I'm thinking in New York City where I live, we have so many great restaurants, or at least we have had. I can't imagine that a large number of them, notwithstanding the monies that the government is putting out there to try to keep them in business, that lots of them will be gone because a lot of these are little businesses that don't have much extra in the way of financial resources. But besides that, supply chain disruptions. But I'm thinking all along from vertically from the beginning of production all the way to the finished products, there's likely to be a lot of changes, maybe structural changes that are really going to change the way we do business. I mean, I'm thinking right now, conferences that I used to go to, well, they're all being virtual now. So do you see this as really long range changes? And then the other thing is if people don't have, if they really are having a hard time financially, and I can't imagine the middle class not having a tremendously difficult time going forward here, that there, as you're suggesting, there could be some really long-lasting changes. This might not just be a year or two. This could be something that's kind of permanent. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think there's been a permanent shift in the general approach to life, the economy, the way people view things. It's rattled them, and people are there are a lot of people who are suffering. I don't know too many people who are having a good circumstance at the moment, or those who are well positioned for a variety of reasons. But on average, the average guy is not doing well.
No, that's for sure.
Down, and it certainly does not help the general outlook. But if you've been laid off, now seeing you look at these unemployment numbers that coming out or will be coming out. I can give a couple of things that we'll be seeing very shortly. Consider now, back in February, we were at an all-time low unemployment rate of 3.5%, lowest going back to, say, 1960. This is the headline number. March, that jumped to 4.4%. But you had a real strange thing happen here. And then this is unprecedented. And again, this is the rapidity with which things got hit. Consider that first 2 weeks of March, the unemployment claims had been continuing as they had for months before, averaging between 200 and 250,000 per week. Then you jump to the third week in March. That jumps to a little over 3 million, and then you're up to almost 7 million the week after that, and then 6 and 5. Right now we're averaging 5 million unemployment claims per week.
A week.
Well, this is what the unusual thing here is that the government doesn't coordinate these numbers.
Yeah.
The headline unemployment rate is based on surveying generally done mid-month, and in this particular case, the surveying was done for the week right before you had the big jump in the so that 4.4%. If you counted the new claims that came in those last 2 weeks. And again, normally it wouldn't make any difference because there's not much of a variation, but with that particular variation, it's worth looking at it. Instead of being 4.4%, with those claims, the unemployment rate was 10.4%, which was basically ties the worst post-Great Depression level, which was in 1980 at 10.4%.
I remember.
Next month, based on what's already been reported, that's going to jump to 22%.
Oof.
That hasn't been seen since the Great Depression.
Wow. And I can't believe those numbers are factored in the equity market yet, John.
No, I don't think so. And as you know, I do look at alternative numbers here, particularly where the numbers have been played with. If the government's giving you fair numbers, I go along with them. And they used to give you a fair unemployment rate. But what happened back in 1994 was that we were entering into after. And the effect of that was that it was going to displace a number of American workers in favor of cheaper labor within our new trade group. So the government decided it would change the way it looked at the longer-term unemployed, what they called the discouraged workers.
Yes.
Because they didn't want a big jump there. And it used to be, if you hadn't worked for a year and you'd given up looking for work because there weren't any jobs to be had, It still counts you as a discouraged worker going forward. But after change in 1984, they wouldn't count you any further.
Wow.
It made, and it was done very specifically to lower the bad news that would be coming out of NAFTA. That rate right now, in terms of the people who are long-term discouraged, would like a job but just can't find one. That's going to be at 40% in April, and that's already based on the numbers out there. It's not been reported. They don't. That's my estimate. The government doesn't report that, but the government's again unemployment rate's going to be
incredible. Well, John, what they're going to be doing then is printing untold trillions of dollars. And does the dollar survive? And if not, what replaces it? That's the last question I have time to ask you today. But will the dollar survive this? And if not, what replaces it?
I don't think it will, because it's in hyperinflation. Usually they'll end up with a new dollar or something. It's still relatively strong against most currencies. Swiss franc generally has been outshining it, but the Swiss franc no longer is backed by gold either. And but the one thing the Swiss do, they pretend that they still have it, and they run their policies so that it's more along the lines of the way we used to run ours in terms of looking at long range solvency for the government and such. So it's still viewed as generally a stronger currency than the dollar. But yes, you mentioned this could be a global hyperinflation. That's a possibility.
Yeah.
It's
and then there must be some sort of a new Bretton Woods or some sort of a reset globally, I would think, possibly with some gold component to it.
Well, the thing is, the way they might normally handle it is certainly what Zimbabwe did, is they just knock some zeros off the bills.
Yeah, right.
And my son got interested in this after I started talking to him about it, and he put together a collection for me of the bills, and the $2 bill, and it ended up as a $100 trillion bill. And there's also beyond other devaluations, and the calculation was that if you took what had been a $2 bill originally, and which was worth $3 to us at the time, and looked at its final iteration, and he just had a number of $2 bills to get to that level, the pile of bills would literally stretch from here to the Andromeda galaxy.
It's incredible.
They kept going, and they changed the zeros or whatever. And that's the problem. Is you can do that, and you can devalue it. But if you hold the gold will retain its purchasing power.
Right, and and that's right, and of course all the other dislocations that result from disguising price discovery in markets, including the capital markets. John, one last question. I have to ask you this one yet. So gold is likely to track inflation. It's likely to be a good proxy for it. As a person who invests in gold mining companies, I know very well that costs can also go up very dramatically. So we're talking about energy costs, which right now are very favorable for gold miners, as you note. I mean, they're just incredibly trashed right now, the oil price. Copper's lower. Some of these basic inputs into mining. Do you suppose that, generally speaking, the whole commodity complex will track inflation as well?
I'd say that's probably a fair bet.
Okay. All right. So what it really boils down to then, from my perspective, as one who analyzes gold mining projects, is probably richer gold deposits will do better than the lower grade deposits that require a lot of energy. Every mine is different, but I just wanted to ask you that question because it's of great concern to me as I look at mining companies and try to invest in mining projects. Of course, if you have hyperinflation, everything gets distorted, and I think it's very hard to do business when that happens, right?
It is. Yeah. The stories. I mean, I knew some people who went through the Weimar Republic inflation, and there's a lot of stories out there. I mean, you get the stories that you heard about Weimar were repeated in Zimbabwe, where people would use a currency for things ranging from wallpaper to cleansing themselves after using the toilet, and that's what it was.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to leave it go at that, John. I thank you very much for taking your time to talk to us. It's shadowstats.com, folks. If you really want to keep track of what's actually going on, the real true numbers, I don't know of any place better to go to than John Williams, shadowstats.com. Thank you so much for being with us, John, and we'll probably want to keep up with you from time to time to see what your latest thoughts are on this pandemic and the influence it's having on the global economy. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and forward to talking with you.
bet. Thank you, John.